Hello, my name is Midnight Dave. Thank you for joining us for Scary Stories to Tell on Sundays, a weekly series part of Hallo'Boogie, a virtual, month-long Halloween celebration brought to you by the Midnite Romero Society. Each week we will be presenting a collection of short stories split into two categories, family-friendly and mature, and read them to you in celebration of the wonderful month of October. So without further ado,
Goodnight, Goon, a petrifying parody by Michael Rex.
Now I want to see.
In the coal gray tomb, there was a gravestone in a black lagoon and a picture of Martians taking over the moon. And there were 3 little mummies rubbing their tummies.
What's this?
Let's find out. And 2 hairy claws.
Bats.
Bats, yeah. And a set of jaws.
And what is that jaw?
Looks kind of like a plant creature, doesn't it? Pretend silly creature. What do you think it looks like?
Ghost.
A ghost?
Yeah, a ghost with pointy claws. It's fur. And do you know what that? That's a flying squirrel.
A flying squirrel. And a skull. And a shoe. And a pot full of
Goo.
goo.
Yeah.
Yuck. And an old hairy werewolf who was hollering,
Boo!
"Boo!"
That's so.
Goodnight, tomb.
A claw. It's green.
Yeah.
What's it called?
What's it called?
What that
It's just
green?
a little claw. Look at. He's waving at us. All right. Good night, tomb. Good night, Goon. Good night, Martians taking over the moon. Good night, Bones in the black lagoon.
Oh, this is the mommy.
It's a mummy, yeah. Good night, mummies.
What's that tangle thing?
Point to it again.
What's that pink
This?
tangle thing is?
Oh, this? It's just a creature. Good night, mummies.
Oh, I think it's that.
You think it's that? Good night, tummies. See, they're still rubbing their tummy. Good night, claws.
What? That kind of dragging up.
Oh, it's so silly and pretend. And good night, jaws.
Ah, a ghost.
Ooh.
There's another.
There is. How many ghosts are there?
2.
One.
This one is sad. This one
2.
is sad.
Yeah? Do you think they want that hat back?
Yes.
Good night, moans. And good night, groans.
What's this? Oh, that's the witch's hat.
That's right. Good night, screechy bat. Show me the bat. And good night, hat.
And those guys are not nice.
They should give that hat back, huh? Good night, skull. And good night, shoe.
Ah!
Oh, there's the other shoe. He's wearing one shoe. He's missing his shoe. Good night, shoe. Good night, creature. And good night, goo.
Yeah.
Yuck. And good night to the old werewolf hollering,
Boo!
"Boo!" Woo! many ghosts do you guys see on this page? Spooky white ghosts.
2.
Good job. So silly. Oh,
It's a very silly book.
it's very silly.
And look at that guy. He's not nice here.
He looks sad. Good night, you. Get under there.
And who's that?
A creature.
What's this?
Monsters sleeping. Because look, it says, good night, monsters everywhere. Good night. Look, he's sleeping under there.
Oh, look at that.
Sleeping. He's taking his shoes off and he went night-night. He's all tucked in. And the end.
Hello everyone, Midnight Dave here again. Just letting you know that this concludes our family-friendly segment, and up next is our mature segment, so listener discretion is advised. Thank you, and hope you enjoy.
Hello, this is Michael Welch of the Midnite Romero Society, and I am spending this Scary Stories to Tell on Sunday episode featuring Mr. Clive Barker. I'll be reading from his latest novel, The Scarlet Gospels. I'll be reading the prologue, and if we have time, I'll be reading a very short piece after that. The Scarlet Gospels, which is definitely a Hellraiser story for those who are fans. This is the prologue, Liber Diabolus. 1. After the long quiet of the grave, Joseph Rogowski gave voice, and it was not pleasant in either sound or sentiment. "Look at you all," he said, scrutinizing the 5 magicians who'd woken him from his dreamless sleep. "You look ghostly, every one of you." "You don't look so good yourself, Joe," Lily Saffro said. "Your embalmer was a little too enthusiastic with the rouge and the eyeliner." Rogowski snarled, his hand going up to his cheek and wiping off some of the makeup that had been used to conceal the sickening pallor his violent death had left on him. He'd been hastily embalmed, no doubt, and filed away in his ledge within the family mausoleum, in a cemetery on the outskirts of Hamburg. "I hope you didn't go to all this trouble just to take cheap shots at me," Rogowski said, surveying the paraphernalia that littered the floor around him. "Regardless, I'm impressed. Necromantic workings demanded an obsessive's eye for detail. The Ingese working, which was the one the magicians had used to raise Rogowski, called for the eggs of pure white doves that had been injected with the blood of a girl's first menstruation, to be cracked into 11 alabaster bowls surrounding the corpse, each of which contained other obscure ingredients. Purity was of the essence of this working. The birds couldn't be speckled, the blood had to be fresh, and the 2,709 numerals that were inscribed in black chalk starting beneath the ring of bowls and spiraling inward to the spot where the corpse of the resurrectee was laid had to be in precisely the right order, with no erasures, breaks, or corrections. "This is your work, isn't it, Elizabeth?" Rogowski said. The oldest of the 5 magicians, Elizabeth Kotlov, a woman whose skills in some of the most complex and volatile of magic preservations weren't enough to keep her face from looking like someone who'd lost both her appetite and her ability to sleep decades ago, nodded. "Yes," she said. "We need your help, Joey." "It's a long time since you called me that," Rogowski said, "and it was usually when you were fucking me. Am I being fucked right now?" Kotlov threw a quick glance at her fellow magicians, Lily Saffro, Yashar Headat, Arnold Poltash, and Theodore Felixson, and saw that they were no more amused by Rogowski's insults than she was. "I see that death hasn't robbed you of your bitter tongue," she said. "For fuck's sake," said Poltash. "This has been the problem all along. Whatever we did or didn't do, whatever we had or didn't have, none of it matters." He shook his head. "The time we wasted fighting to outdo one another, when we could have been working together, it makes me want to weep." "You weep," said Theodore Felixson. "I'll fight." Yes, please, spare us your tears, Arnold, Lily said. She was the only one of the 5 Summoners sitting, for the simple reason that she was missing her left leg. We all wish we could change things. Lily, dear, Rogowski said, I can't help but notice that you're not quite the woman you were. What's happened to your leg? Actually, she said, I got lucky. He nearly had me, Joseph. He? You mean he hasn't been stopped? We're a dying breed, Joseph, said Poltash, a veritable endangered species. How many of the circle are left? Joseph said, a sudden urgency in his voice. There was a silence while the 5 exchanged hesitant looks. It was Kotlov who finally spoke. We are all that is left, she said, staring at one of the alabaster bowls and its blood-stained contents. You? 5? No. All the sarcasm and the petty game playing had gone from Rogowski's voice and manner. Even the embalmer's bright paints could not moderate the horror on Rogowski's face. How long have I been dead? 3 years, Kotlov said. This has to be a joke. How is that possible? Rogowski said. There were 271 in the high circle alone. Yes, said Hayada. And that's only those who chose to be counted among us. There's no telling how many he took from outside the circles. Hundreds? Thousands? And no telling what they owned either, Lily Safro said. We had a reasonably thorough list. But even that wasn't complete, Poltash said. We all have our secret possessions. I know I do. Ah, too true, Felixson said. 5, Rogowski said, shaking his head. Why couldn't you put your heads together and work out some way to stop him? That's why we went to all the trouble of bringing you back, Hayadot said. Believe me, none of us did it happily. You think we didn't try to catch the bastard? We fucking tried. But the demon is goddamn clever. And getting cleverer all the time, Kotlov said. In a way, you should be flattered. He took you early because he'd done his homework. He knew you were the only one who could unite us all against him. And when you died, we argued and pointed fingers like squabbling schoolchildren. Poltash sighed. He picked us off, one by one, moving all over the globe so we never knew where he was going to strike next. A lot of people got taken without anybody knowing a thing about it. We'd hear about it later, usually after a few months, sometimes even a year, just by chance. You'd try to make contact with someone and find their house had been sold, or burned to the ground, or simply left to rot. I visited a couple of places like that. Remember Brander's house in Bali? I went there. And Dr. Bigonzoli's place outside Rome? I went there too. There was no sign of any looting. The locals were far too afraid of what they'd heard about the occupants to take a step inside their house, even despite the fact that it was very obvious nobody was home. What did you find? Rogowski said. Poltash took out a pack of cigarettes and lit one as he went on. His hands were trembling, and it took some help from Kotlov to steady the hand that held his lighter. Everything of any magical value had vanished. Brander's Urtexts, Bigonzoli's collection of Vatican Apocrypha, everything down to the most trivial, blasphemous pamphlet was gone. The shelves were bare. It was obvious that Brander had put up a struggle. There was a lot of blood in the kitchen, of all places. Do we really have to go back over all this? Hayadot said. We all know how these stories end. You dragged me out of a very welcome death to help save your souls, Rogowski said. The least you can do is let me hear the facts. Arnold, continue. Well, the blood was old. There was a lot of it, but it had dried many months before. Was it the same with Bigonzoli? Rogowski said. Bigonzoli's place was still sealed up when I visited. Shutters closed and doors locked, as if he'd gone on a long vacation, but he was still inside. I found him in the study. Christ, Joseph, he was hanging from the ceiling by chains. They were attached to hooks that had been put through his flesh. And it was so hot in there. My guess is he'd been dead in that dry heat for at least 6 months. His body was completely withered up, but the expression on his face could have just been the way the flesh had retreated from around his mouth as it dried up. But by God, he looked as though he died screaming. Rogowski studied the faces before him. So while you were having your private wars over mistresses and boys, this demon ended the lives and pillaged the minds of the most sophisticated magicians on the planet. In some, Poltash said, yes. Why? What is his intention? Have you at least discovered that? The same as ours, we think, Felixson said. The getting and keeping of power. He hasn't just taken our treaties, scrolls, and grimoires. He's cleaned out all the vestments, all the talismans, all the amulets. Hush, Rogowski said suddenly. Listen. There was a silence among them for a moment, and then a funereal bell chimed softly in the distance. Oh, Christ, Lily said. It's his bell. The dead man laughed. He's found you. 2. The assembled company, excepting the once-deceased Rogowski, instantly loosed a flood of prayers, protestations, and entreaties, no two of which were in the same language. Thank you for the gift of second life, old friends, Rogowski said. Few people get the pleasure of dying twice, especially by the same executioner. Rogowski stepped out of his coffin, kicked over the first of the alabaster bowls, and began working his way around the necromantic circle in a counterclockwise direction. The broken eggs and the menstrual blood, along with the other ingredients of the bowls, each one different but all a vital part of the Yengi's working, were spilled across the floor. One bowl rolled off on its rim, weaving wildly before hitting one of the mausoleum walls. That was just childish, Kotlov said. Sweet Jesus, Poltash said, the bell is getting louder. We made our peace with one another to get your help and protect ourselves, Felixson shouted. Surrender can't be our only option. I won't accept it. You made your peace too late, Rogowski said, bringing his foot down and grinding the broken bowls into a powder. Maybe if there had been 50 of you, all sharing your knowledge, you might have had a hope. But, as it stands, you're outnumbered. Outnumbered? You mean he has functionaries? Hayadot said. Good God. Is it the fog of death or the years that have passed? I honestly don't remember you people being this stupid. The demon has imbibed the knowledge of countless minds. He doesn't need backup. There's not an incantation in existence that can stop him. It can't be true, screamed Felixson. I'm sure I would have said the same hopeless thing 3 years ago, but that was before my untimely demise, Brother Theodore. We should disperse, Hayadot said, all in different directions. I'll head to Paris. You're not listening, Yashar. It's too late, Rogowski said. You can't hide from him. I am proof. You're right, said Hayadot. Paris is too obvious. Somewhere more remote, then. While Hayadot laid his panicked plans, Elizabeth Kotlov, apparently resigned to the reality of her circumstances, took the time to speak conversationally with Rogowski. They said they found your body in the temple of Femestrian. It seemed an odd place for you to be, Joseph. Did he bring you there? Rogowski stopped and looked at her for a moment before saying no. It was my own hiding place, actually. There was a room behind the altar, tiny, dark. I thought I was safe. And he found you anyway. Rogowski nodded. Then, trying to keep his tone offhand and failing, he said, How did I look? I wasn't there, but by all accounts appalling. He'd left you in your little hidey hole with his hook still in you. Did you tell him where all your manuscripts were? Poltash asked. With a hook and chain up through my asshole, pulling my stomach down into my bowels? Yes, Arnold, I did. I squealed like a rat in a trap. And then he left me there, with that chain slowly disemboweling me, until he'd gone to my house and brought back everything I'd hidden. I wanted so badly to die by that time, I remember, that I literally begged him to kill me. I gave him information he didn't even ask for. All I wanted was death, which I got, finally. And I was never more grateful for anything in my life. Jesus wept, Felixson yelled. Look at you all, listening to this babble. We raised the son of a bitch to get some answers, not recount his fucking horror stories. You want answers, Rogowski snapped. Here, then. Get yourself some paper and write down the whereabouts of every last grimoire, pamphlet, and article of power you own. Everything. He's going to get the information anyway, sooner or later. You, Lily. You have the only known copy of Sanderegger's Cruelties, yes? Maybe. For fuck's sake, woman, Poltash said. He's trying to help. Yes, I own it, Lily Sappho said. It's in a safe buried below my mother's coffin. Write it down. The address of the cemetery. The position of the plot. Draw a goddamn blueprint if you have to. Just make it easy for him. Hopefully he'll return the favor. I have no paper, Hayadot said, his voice suddenly shrill and boyish with fear. Somebody give me a piece of paper. Here, said Elizabeth, tearing a sheet from an address book she pulled out of her pocket. Poltash was writing on an envelope, which he had pressed up against the marble wall of the mausoleum. I don't see how this saves us from his tampering with our brains, he said, scribbling furiously. It doesn't, Arnold. It's merely a gesture of humility, something none of us have been very familiar with in our lives. But it may, and I make no guarantees, it may hold sway. Oh, Christ, said Hayadot. I see light between the cracks. The magician glanced up from their scrawling to see what he was talking about. At the far end of the mausoleum, a cold blue light was piercing the fine cracks between the marble blocks. Our visitor is imminent, said Rakowski. Elizabeth, dear? Joseph, she said, failing to glance up from her fevered scribbling. Release me, will you please? In a minute. Let me finish writing. Release me, goddamn you, he said. I don't want to be here when he comes. I don't ever want to see that horrible face of his again. Patience, Joseph, Poltash said. We're only heeding your advice. Someone give me back my death. I can't go through this again. Nobody should have to. The swelling light from beyond the mausoleum walls was now accompanied by a grinding sound as one of the enormous marble blocks, at about head height, slowly pushed itself out of the wall. When it was roughly 10 inches clear of the wall, a second block, below and to the left of the first one, began to move. Seconds later, a third, this time to the right and above the first, also began shifting. The glittering silver-blue shafts of light that had begun this unknitting came in wherever there was a crack for them to steal through. Rogowski, enraged at the indifference of his resurrectors, resumed the destruction of Kotlov's necromantic labors where he'd left off. He grabbed the alabaster bowls and hurled them against the moving wall. Then, pulling off the jacket he'd been buried in, he got down on his knees and used it to scrub out the numbers Kotlov had scrawled in the immaculate spiral. Dead though he was, beads of fluid appeared on his brow as he scrubbed. It was a dark, thick liquid that collected at his forehead and finally fell from his face and spattered on the ground, a mingling of embalming fluid and some remnants of his own corrupted juices. But his effort to undo the resurrection began to pay off. A welcome numbness started spreading from his fingers and toes up into his limbs, and a lulling weight gathered behind his eyes and sinuses, as the semi-liquefied contents of his skull responded to the demands of gravity. Glancing up from his work, he saw the 5 magicians scrawling madly like students racing to finish a vital examination paper before the tolling of the bell. Except, of course, the price of failure was rather worse than a bad mark. Rogowski's gaze went from their toil to the wall, where 6 blocks were now on the move. The first of the 6 marble blocks that had responded to the pressure from the other side finally slid clear of the wall and dropped to the ground. A shaft of frigid light, lent solidity by the marble cement dust that hung in the air from the unseated block, spilled from the hole and crossed the length of the mausoleum, striking the opposite wall. The second block dropped only moments later. Theodore Felixson began to pray aloud as he wrote, the divinity at his prayer's destination usefully ambiguous. Thine the power, thine the judgment. Take my soul, Lord, shape and use it. I am weak, Lord. I am fearful. It's not another Lord we need in here, Elizabeth said. It's a goddess. And so saying, she began her own entreaty. Honey-breasted art thou, Netha. Call me daughter. I will suckle. While Felixson continued the thread of his own prayer. Save me, Lord, from fear and darkness. Hold me fast against your heart, Lord. Hayadot interrupted his battle of supplications with a bellow that only a man of his considerable proportions could have unleashed. I never heard such naked hypocrisy in my life. When did you two ever have faith in anything besides your own covetousness? If the demon can hear you, he's laughing. "You are wrong," said a voice from the place out of which the cold light came. The words, though in themselves unremarkable, seemed to escalate the wall's capitulation. 3 more blocks began to grind their way forward, while another 2 dropped out of the wall and joined the debris accruing on the mausoleum floor. The unseen speaker continued to address the magicians. His voice, with its glacial severity, made the harsh light seem tropical by a contrast. "I smell decaying flesh," the demon said, "but with a quickening perfume. Someone has been raising the dead." Yet more of the blocks toppled to the ground, so that now there would have been a hole in the wall large enough to allow the entrance of a man of some stature, except for the fact that rubble blocked the lower third of the space. For the entity about to make its entrance, however, such matters were easily resolved. "O vat porak," it said. The order was obeyed instantly. The rubble, listening intently, divided in a heartbeat. Even the air itself was cleansed for him, for as he spoke every particle of cement dust was snatched from his path. And thus, his way unhindered, the Cenobite entered into the presence of the 6 magicians. He was tall, looking very much as he did in those volumes of notable demons that the magicians had pored over in recent months and weeks, vainly looking for some hint of frailty in the creature. They had found none, of course, but now, as he appeared in the flesh, there was a distant sense of humanity in his being, of the man he had once been, before the monstrous labors of his order had been performed. His flesh was virtually white, his hairless head ritualistically scarred with deep grooves that ran both horizontally and vertically, at every intersection of which a nail had been hammered through the bloodless flesh and into his bone. Perhaps at one time the nails had gleamed, but the years had tarnished them. No matter, for the nails possessed a certain elegance, enhanced by the way the demon held his head, as though regarding the world with an air of weary condescension. Whatever torments he had planned for these last victims, and his knowledge of pain and its mechanisms would have made the inquisitors look like schoolyard bullies. It would be worsened by orders of magnitude if any one of them dared utter that irreverent nickname Pinhead, the origins of which were long lost in claim and counterclaim. As for the rest of his appearance, it was much as it had been depicted in the etchings and woodcuts of demonic listings for millennia. The black vestments, the hem of which brushed the floor, the patches of skinned flesh exposing blood-beaded muscle, and the skin tightly interwoven with the fabric of his robes. There had always been debates as to whether the damned soul who wore this mask of pain and its accompanying vestments was a single man who'd lived many human lifetimes, or whether the order of the gash passed the scars and nails on to another soul after the labors of temptation had exhausted their present possessor. There was certainly evidence for either belief in the state of the demon before them. He looked like a creature that had lived too long, his eyes set in bruised pools, his gait steady but slow. But the tools that hung from his belt, an amputation saw, a trepanning drill, a small chisel, and 3 silver syringes, were, like the abattoir's worker's chainmail apron he wore, wet with blood. Confirmation that his weariness did not apparently keep him from taking a personal hand in the practicalities of agony. He brought flies with him, too, fat, blue-black flies in their thousands. Many buzzed around his waist, alighting on the instruments to take their share of wet human meat. They were 4 or 5 times the size of terrestrial flies, and their busy noise echoed around the mausoleum. The demon stopped, regarded Rogowski with something resembling curiosity. "Joseph Rogowski," the Cenobite said, "your suffering was sweet, but you died too soon. It pleases me to see you standing there." Rogowski tensed. "Do your worst, demon. I have no need to pillage your mind a second time." He turned and faced the 5 quivering magicians. "It's these 5 I came to catch, more for closure than the hope of revelation. I've been to magic's length and breadth. I've explored its outermost limits, and rarely, very rarely, I've mined the thoughts of a truly original thinker. If, as Whitehead said, all philosophy is footnotes to Plato, then all magic is footnotes to 12 great texts I now possess. Lily Saffro had started to hyperventilate a little way into the demon's speech, and now reached into her purse, digging frantically through its chaotic contents. My pills! Oh, Jesus, Jesus, where are my pills? In her jittery state, she lost her grip on one end of her purse, and its contents fell out, spreading across the floor. She went to her knee, found the bottle, and snatched up her pills, oblivious to everything but getting them into her mouth. She chewed and swallowed the large white tablets like candies, staying on the ground, clutching her chest, and taking deep breaths. Felixson spoke, ignoring her panicked outburst. I have 4 safes, he told the demon. I've written down their whereabouts and their codes. If that's too much trouble for you, I'll fetch them myself, or you could accompany me. It's a big house. You might like it. Cost me $18 million. It's yours. You and your brethren are welcome to it. My brethren? The Cenobite said. Apologies. They are sisters in your order, too. I was forgetting that. Well, I'm sure I own enough works for you to pass around. I know you said you've got all the magic texts, but I do have very fine first editions, nearly perfect, most of them. Before the demon could respond to this, Heodot said, Your Lordship, or is it Your Grace, Your Holiness? Master. Like a dog? Heodot said. Surely, Felixson said, wanting desperately to please the demon. If he says we're dogs, then dogs we are. Well stated, the demon said. But words are easy. Down, dog. Felixson waited for a moment, hoping this had just been a throwaway remark, but it was not. I said down, the demon warned. Felixson began to kneel. The demon went on. And naked. Dogs go naked, surely. Oh, yes, of course, naked. Felixson proceeded to undress. And you, the demon said, extending his pale finger toward Kotlov. Elizabeth Kotlov. Be his bitch. Naked as well, on your hands and knees. Without further prompting, she started to unbutton her blouse, but he said, Wait, and walked toward her, the flies rising up from their blood-clotted dining places as he moved. Elizabeth flinched, but the demon merely reached out and placed his hand on her lower belly. How many abortions have you had, woman? I count 11 here. That's right, she stuttered. Most wombs would not survive such unkindness. He clenched his fist, and Elizabeth let out a little gasp. But even at your advanced age, I can give your abused womb the capacity to finally do what it was made to do. No, Elizabeth said, more in disbelief than denial. You couldn't. The child will be here soon. Elizabeth was out of words. She simply stared at the demon as though she could somehow make him take pity on her. Now, he said, be a good bitch and get down on all fours. May I say something? Poltash said. You may try. I could be very useful to you. I mean, my circle of influence reaches to Washington. What is your offer? I am simply saying there are a lot of people in high office who owe their positions to me. I could make them report to you with a single phone call. It's not magical power, I grant you, but you seem to have all you need of that. What are you asking in return? Just my life. Then you name the names in Washington you need at your feet, and I'll make it happen. The Cenobite didn't reply. His attention had been claimed by the sight of Felixson, who was standing in his underwear, with Elizabeth beside him, still preserving her modesty. I said naked, the demon snapped. Both of you. Look at that belly of yours, Elizabeth. How it swells. What about those tired tits? How do they look now? He pulled off the remains of her blouse and the brassiere beneath. The dry purses of her breasts were indeed growing fuller. You'll do for one more breeding. and this time you won't be scraping it out of your womb. What do you think of my offer? Poltash asked, vying for the demon's attention. But before the demon could respond, Hayadot interrupted. He's a liar, he said. He's more of a palm reader than an advisor. Shut your fucking mouth, Hayadot, Poltash said. Hayadot continued. I know for a fact that Washington prefers that woman Sita Caro. Ah, yes, I have her reminiscences, the demon said, tapping his temple. And you pass it all on to your order, right? Hayadot inquired. Do I? Surely the other members of your order are not with me. Hayadot blanched, suddenly understanding. You're acting alone. Hayadot's revelation was interrupted by a moan from Elizabeth Kotlov, who was now on all fours beside the Cenobite's other dog, Theodore Felixson. Her belly and breasts were now round and ripe, the Cenobite's influence powerful enough to already have her nipples leaking milk. Don't let that go to waste, the Cenobite said to Felixson. Put your face to the floor and lick it up. As Felixson too eagerly bent to his task, Poltash, who had apparently lost all confidence in his offer, made a mad dash for the door. He was 2 strides short of the threshold when the Cenobite threw a look into the passageway from which he'd come. Something glittering and serpentine there sped from the other side of the wall, crossing into the chamber, and caught Poltash in the back of his neck. A beat later, 3 more came after it, chains, all of them ending in what looked like hooks big enough to catch sharks, wrapping themselves around Poltash at the neck, chest, and waist. Poltash shrieked with pain. The Hell Priest listened to the sound the man made with the attentiveness of a connoisseur. Shrill and inexpensive. I expected better from one who lasted this long. The chains rent themselves in 3 different directions, trisecting Poltash in the blink of an eye. For a moment the magician stood there looking dazed, and then his head rolled off his neck and hit the mausoleum floor with a sickening plop. Seconds later his body followed after, spilling his steaming intestines and stomach, along with their half-digested contents, onto the ground. The demon raised his nose and inhaled, taking in the aroma. Better. Then a tiny gesture from the Cenobite, and the chains that had ended Poltash's life snaked across the floor and slithered up the door, wrapping themselves around the handle. Tightening themselves, they pulled the door closed and raised their hooked heads like a trinity of cobras ready to strike, dissuading any further attempts at escape. 3. Some things are better done in private, don't you think, Joseph? Do you remember how it was for us? You offered to be my personal assassin, and then you shit yourself. Aren't you a little tired of all this by now? Rogowski replied. How much suffering can you cause before it fails to give you whatever sad, sick thing it is you need? Each to their own. You went through a phase when you wouldn't touch a girl over 13. Will you just do it already? Rogowski said. Soon. You are the last. After you, there'll be no more games. Only war. War? Said Rogowski. There'll be nobody left to fight. I see death has not made a wise man of you, Joseph. Did you really think this was all about your pitiful secret society? What then? Hayadot asked. If I am to die, I'd like to know the reason. The demon turned. Hayadot looked into the shiny darkness of his eyes, and as if in answer to Hayadot's question, the Cenobite spat a word in the direction of the open wall. A flight of 20 hooks, trailed by glinting chains, came at Hayadot, catching him everywhere. Mouth, throat, breasts, belly, groin, legs, feet, and hands. The Cenobite was bypassing the torture and interrogation and going straight to the execution. Lost in his agonies, Hayadot babbled as the hooks steadily worked themselves deeper into his 350-pound body. It was hard to make much sense of what he was saying through the snot and the tears, but he seemed to be listing the books in his collection, as though he might still be able to strike a bargain with the beast. The Zvia Kisor Diallo, the only remaining of Ghaffari's null. The Cenobite then called 7 more chains into play, which came swiftly, sweeping around Hayadot from all directions. They hooked themselves into his shuddering body and wrapped themselves so tightly the fat man's flesh oozed from between the rusted links. Lily edged herself into the corner and covered her face with her hands. The others, even Kotlov, who appeared now to be 8 months into her term while Felixson hammered at her from behind, looked up as Hayadot continued to chatter and sob. Mazev's names of infernal territories. All 27 chains had now secured themselves in the man's body. The Cenobite murmured another order, and the chains proceeded to tighten further, pulling on Hayadot's body from several directions. Even now, with flesh and bone under unbearable stress, he continued to list his treasures. Oh God! Lampe's symphony, the Death Symphony, Romeo Refra's, Yellow Night, Rogowski prompted. He was watching Hayadot's torment with a dispassion perhaps only a dead man could have worn. Yes, and Hayadot started to say. There the list stopped, however, as Hayadot, only now comprehending what was happening to him, unleashed a stream of pleading cries, all rising in volume as his body was subjected to the contrary demands of the hooks. His body could not withstand the claims made upon it any longer. His skin began to tear, and he started to thrash wildly, his last coherent words, his entreaties, overtaken by the ragged howls of agony that he now unleashed. His belly flesh succumbed first. The hooks there had gone deep. It ripped away a wedge of bright yellow fat 10 inches thick, and some of the muscle beneath. His breasts came next, skin and fat, followed by blood. Even Lily watching now through her fingers as the spectacle escalated. The hook in Hayadot's left leg, which had entered behind his shin bone, broke it with a crack that was loud enough to be audible above Hayadot's screams. His ears came off with scraps of scalp attached. His shoulder blades were both broken as the hooks there pulled themselves free. But despite the thrashing, the screams, and the reflecting pool of black blood below his body, now so large it lapped against the hem of the Cenobite's vestments, the demon was not satisfied. He issued new instructions, using one of the oldest tricks in magic, Tulfosprach. He whispered instructions, and 3 new hooks, larger than any that had come before, their outer edges sharp as scalpels, flew at the exposed fat and flesh of Hayadot's chest and stomach and sliced their way into his interior. The effect of one of the 3 was immediate. It pierced his left lung. His screaming stopped, and he began to gasp for air, his thrashing becoming desperate convulsions. "Finish him in mercy's name," Rogowski said. The Cenobite turned his back on his victim and faced Rogowski. The demon's cold, lifeless stare caused even Rogowski's stiff, reanimated flesh to prickle. Hayadot was the last man to give me orders. You would do well not to follow in his footsteps. Somehow, even after experiencing the hand of death itself, Rogowski still found himself afraid of the calculating demon who stood before him. Taking a deep breath, Rogowski conjured what courage he could. "What are you trying to prove? Do you think if you kill enough people in the worst ways imaginable, they'll give you a name, like the Madman or the Butcher? It doesn't matter how many abhorrent tortures you devise, you'll always be the Pinhead." The air went still. The Cenobite's lip curled. Quick as a flash, he reached out for Rogowski, seized the dead man's scrawny throat, and pulled him close. Without taking his black gaze off Rogowski for an instant, the demon lifted his trephine from his belt, activated the device with his thumb as he brought it to the middle of Rogowski's upper brow. It fired a bolt through Rogowski's skull and then retracted. "Pinhead," Rogowski said, undeterred. The Cenobite made no reply. He simply hooked the trephine back in his belt and put his fingers into his own mouth, seeking out something that lodged within. Finding it, he drew the thing out, a small, slick, blackened hunk, like a diseased tooth. He returned his fingers to the hole in Rogowski's skull, inserting the object and letting go of Rogowski's throat in the same moment. "I'm guessing I'll be dead soon, right? To paraphrase Churchill, I'll be dead in the morning, but you'll still be Pinhead," Rogowski growled. The Cenobite had already turned his back on Rogowski. The hooks that held Hayadot in place had clearly waited for their master to turn back to them before they performed their coup de grace. Now, blessed with his gaze, they showed their skills. The hook, a weapon that the demon had affectionately named the fisherman's hook, was attached to a chain that had found purchase in the ceiling. It suddenly and swiftly tore through the roof of Hayadot's mouth, lifting his entire body clear of the ground. The moment the Cenobite's gaze landed upon the rusty, blood-caked links, eruption followed eruption. Hayadot's hands split in two, the feet the same. The huge bulk of his thighs was gouged from groin to knees. His face was stripped of skin, and the 3 deeply embedded hooks in his chest and stomach pulled out heart, lungs, and entrails all at once. Surely a faster autopsy had never taken place. Their task complete, the hooks dragged what parts of him they'd claimed through the pools of blood back toward the place from whence they'd come. Only one remained, the fisherman's hook, from which the empty and significantly lighter carcass of Yasha Hayadot hung slowly, swinging back and forth, the drooping doors of his stomach, bright with fat, flapping open and closed. All the fireworks were red again tonight, the Cenobite said, as though bored of the whole affair. Felixson, still rutting like a dog, pulled himself out of Kotlov and retreated from the spreading blood. Seeking purchase, his hand landed on something soft. He turned and his face fell. Lily was all he said. The demon turned his head to see what Felixson saw. It was Lily Sappho. The sight of Hayadot's slaughter had apparently been too much for her. She was slumped dead against the far wall. There was a stricken expression on her face, and her hands still clutched at her chest. "Let's be done with this," the demon said, turning to face the 3 remaining magicians. "You, Felixson." The man's face was all snot and tears. "Me? You play the dog well. I have work for you. Wait for me in the passage." Felixson didn't need to be told twice. Wiping his nose, he followed the demon's instructions and fled for the exit. Though Felixson was going naked into hell on the heels of the creature who had slaughtered almost every friend he'd ever had, he was happy with his lot. So happy, in fact, that he scurried through the ragged door in the mausoleum wall to wait for his new master to come to him and never once looked back. He went far enough down the passageway to be reasonably certain he would not hear the screams of his friends, and then he squatted against the crumbling wall and wept. 4. "What's wrong with me?" Rogowski said. "You're infected with a tiny sibling of mine, Joseph. A worm made from a piece of me. I passed it from its crib beside my cheek into the hole in your skull. Its body is filled with tiny eggs that need only the presence of warm, soft nourishment to be born." Rogowski was not a stupid man. He understood completely the significance of what he'd just been told. It explained the unwelcome fullness in his head, the churning motion behind his eyes, the tang of bitter fluid draining from his nose and down the back of his throat. Rogowski hawked up a wad of phlegm and spat at the Cenobite, who deflected it with a tiny motion of his hand. When it hit the floor, Rogowski saw the truth of the matter. It wasn't phlegm he'd brought up. It was a little knot of worms. "You're an asshole," Rogowski said. "You have the rarest of opportunities to die twice, and you waste your breath with banal insults. I had hoped for more from you, Joseph." Rogowski coughed and in the midst of the hacking lost his breath. He tried to recover it, but his throat was blocked. He dropped to his knees, and the impact was sufficient to burst the fragile panel of his skin so that veins of worms fell from his anatomy, littering the ground around him. Mustering the last of his will, he lifted his head to defy his destroyer with his stare, but before he could do so his eyes dropped back into their sockets, his nose and mouth following quickly after. In seconds his face had gone entirely, leaving only a bowl of bone brimming with the Cenobite's writhing descendants. There was a shrill shriek behind Rogowski, and finally finished with him, the demon turned toward the din. only to find that in his preoccupation with the Rogowski's demolition, he had missed the only pregnancy Kotlov would ever take to full term. The shriek had not come from her, however. She was dead, slumped on her back and torn in two, killed by the trauma of the infant's birth. The thing that the demon had created in her, however, lay in a puddle of its own fetid fluids, shrieking in the tone the demon had mistaken for its mother's voice. The creature was female and, at a glance, virtually human. The demon surveyed the mausoleum. It was indeed a comprehensive spectacle. The pieces of potash sprawled at the door, Hayadot's head and mutilated carcass still swaying slightly as it hung from the fisherman's hook. Lily Sappho, forever frozen, her body ravaged by time, her face a distressing testament to the empirical power of fear itself, her life claimed by the only thing to which every soul must answer. And finally, Rogowski, collapsed into little more than a mess of bone and worms. The worms, disrespectful guests as that they were, had already begun to desert his remains in search of another feast. The first of the departees had found pieces of Hayadot in one direction, and the half-mangled corpse of Elizabeth Kotlov in the other. The Cenobite knelt between Kotlov's bloodied legs and selected a blade from his belt. Taking the purple clot of the child's birth cord in one hand, he severed it and tied it into a knot. He then found her mother's blouse, mercifully unstained, and wrapped the child in it. Even swaddled, she continued to make a noise like an angry bird. The demon regarded her with a curiosity entirely devoid of concern. "You're hungry," he said. The Cenobite stood, holding on to one end of the silk swaddling, and released the child, letting her unroll high above her mother's corpse. The baby tumbled, then dug her claws deep into the blouse and clung there, looking into her caretaker's eyes, issuing a reptilian hiss as she did so. "Drink," he instructed. He shook the fabric to which his creation clung, and she fell upon her mother's corpse. Getting up onto all fours, the child made her erring way to Elizabeth's left breast, where she kneaded the cooling flesh with her hands, which had already sprouted uncommonly long fingers for an infant so young. And when Kotlov's milk began to once more flow from her lifeless bosom, the child suckled greedily. The demon then turned his back on the child and returned from whence he came, his loyal dog Felixen waiting in the wings. As the bricks and mortar moved back into their original positions, sealing themselves behind the departing demon, the child, still growing, was now easily twice as large as she had been at birth. It was a little after dawn when the Cenobite left the mausoleum, and by that time his progeny had already emptied both breasts and was tearing her mother's chest open for the meat inside. The cracking of the corpse's breastbone echoed loudly around the small, musty room. The naked girl's anatomy was undergoing a violent growth, and every so often could be heard the sound of pain, muted because it came through gritted teeth. Utterly unaware of her father's desertion, the young demon girl moved around the room like a pig at a trough, gluttonously devouring the remains of the once powerful magicians, effectively erasing the last remnants of an order of magic that had been moved behind the shadows of civilization for centuries. By the time the police arrived, alerted by the unwitting soul who discovered the hideous spectacle that was the mausoleum, a frail and broken groundskeeper who vowed he would never again set foot in a cemetery, the girl, fully a woman after less than 12 hours, was gone. And now I see, by the time we have just enough time for this very short story. It is called A Night's Work, also by Mr. Barker. Very difficult to find story. I found it in the Best New Horror compilation, and he wrote it for the Bram Stoker Awards in 2013, and it appeared in their souvenir book at the show there, and so as far as I know, those are the only two places you can find it. So, quick piece of flash fiction here, again, called A Night's Work. I retired to bed a little after 1, exhausted. Sleep came readily enough, but it wasn't an easy slumber. Somewhere in the middle of the night I dreamed a story of great elaboration. It involved, as far as I remember, a race of miniature men and a pair of escalators which I was pursued up and down, for reasons I have now forgotten, but which seemed, in the grip of this dream, essential to the plot. I was highly excited by my story, so much so that in the midst of it I thought to myself, when I've dreamed it all, I'll wake up and write it down. This is a bestseller. I'll make millions. The story came to a wonderful conclusion, satisfying every question it posed. I woke up and hurriedly started to write. Oh, I could scarcely believe it. Every idea, every image was crystal clear. And yes, it was just as riveting now as it had been when I dreamed it. My body ached by the time I'd finished, but I was ecstatic. I turned off the lamp and lay back in bed. But as sleep seemed to come over me again, I realized, with a kind of leaden disappointment, that I had not truly woken, merely dreamed that I'd done so. The story was still unrecorded. I fumbled to recollect what had seemed so pungent moments before, so inevitable, while telling myself, "Wake! Wake, damn it! Quickly now, before you lose it!" It seemed to work. Again, I took the pen in my hand and scribbled out the dream I'd had, but this time I didn't get through half of it before I realized that it was delusory. I let the dreamed pen drop and struggled to catch hold of what was left of the story. Miniature men, yes. Escalators, yes. A woman in a gold dress, perhaps? Or was that something I'd read before I went to bed? And the dog with the blue tail, where did he belong? Had he been an intrinsic part of my immaculate plot, or had he strayed in from somewhere else? Oh, Lord, it was getting muddier by the moment. I woke again, and again I picked up the pen. This time I was deeply suspicious of my state, with reason. After just a few words I knew I was still dreaming, and now my previous story was little more than a few senseless wisps. I would never catch it now, I knew. I despaired of it, and once I relinquished all hope of having my vision intact, I was at last awake. It's pathetic, I know, to be setting down these words, as though the tale of how a glorious thing was lost can be the equal of the thing itself. And as I write, now this very word, this very syllable, the suspicion rises in me that even this faint echo is insubstantial, and must be given up if I am ever to open my eyes. And anyone who has very vivid dreams can probably relate a bit to that story. And, well, I want to thank everybody for listening along and participating in Hallo'Boogie. And I've certainly enjoyed myself, and we'll see you down the road.